Okay, everybody, why don't let me ask that you find seats. Okay, we're going to get started. Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is John Hamry. I want to say greetings to all of you. When Rich Armitage said that he was going to issue his report, the latest Armitage-Nye report, on the 15th of August, I said, "You're crazy. Nobody's in Washington." And well, look at this. This is absolutely fabulous, and I'm delighted to have everyone here. And I think it's because it does speak to the very importance of the topic and the day. Welcome to all of you. We're delighted to have you here, and of course, we're very, very pleased that Secretary Armitage and Secretary Nye, who cannot be here today, but the two of them have been partners in a series of very important studies through the years. And I think fundamentally have shaped the direction for the policy trajectory in the United States, and I think it's had a significant impact as well in Japan with our friends in Japan. And so they see the significance of the day, the significance of the events of these days, and said there needs to be some additional attention now devoted to this topic. And what you have before you is a fine study with true actionable things that you can do. And I think that's really going to be the thrust of the day. What you have here, I rather jokingly said this looked like an old Dutch master's print, except for the two at the end. And thank goodness we've got some diversity in this group, and we're grateful for that. So I would say thank you to all of you for having been participants in this very important effort. And Secretary Armitage, let me turn it to you to get into the content of the day. But thanks all for coming. We look forward to hearing your questions.
Thank you very much, John, and as always, we're gratified to be with our landlord, and we're very grateful to CSIS for all the assistance in helping with this rollout. And I want to say thanks for both Joe and me, for our colleagues who assisted mightily, all who are assembled before you, and two others, actually three, Victor Cha, who's traveling, Cara Bu, who's traveling, and Frank Januzzi, who was an observer to the process. And you are, as you know, looking at a bipartisan group. All three of our reports have had bipartisan participation, and we think that's one of the important signals. Second, if you look at this group, we're not all old. Some of us have a little more moss on our tusks than others, but in a way, you're seeing a new generation of folks who are interested in Asia and certainly interested in Japan. That was another message that we want to send, and we're hopeful that this will encourage folks in Japan, younger folks in Japan, to step up a little more in the whole issue of security studies and Japan's place in the world, etc. Now I'm going to, if I may, tell you what we're going to do today, and then I'm going to make a short introduction. After my introduction, I'm going to read a short paragraph from Joe Nye. He's asked me to expose it to you. We'll ask Mike Green to talk about where we are in the alliance. These are only going to be 5-minute segments at most. We'll leave plenty of time for questions and answers. That'll be followed by Bob McNally, who's going to talk about energy security, something I think both of us have a huge interest in. Kevin Neeler is going to speak about the macro issues, trade and the macroeconomics, and be followed by David Asher, who's going to speak about an idea that he actually came up with, we're calling CISA, and I'll let him explain that to you. Torkel Patterson is going to talk briefly about relations with neighbors, something that's quite topical, particularly in the last couple of days in the region. Randy Shriver will talk about the re-rise of China. After all, that is the backdrop to everything that's going on. Saksakota will talk about security issues, and there's some real meat in those recommendations. And Isabella Morzakowski is going to speak about the PKO. There is a discussion in Tokyo about PKO. We've got some views on it, and Isabella will let you know those. And then Mike and I will wrap it up, and then we'll turn it over to you. And there'll be 3 microphones spread around, and or interns running around with microphones, and you'll be able to stand up. Please identify yourself and ask your questions, and I'll ask Mike Green, who knows most of you, to sort of MC that particular aspect of the presentation. So if I might, let me start the introduction as follows. For our point of view, this report comes at a time of some drift in our relationship. We're not assigning blame to that. In fact, we do note that Kurt Campbell, who's our excellent Assistant Secretary for East Asia and Pacific, and his colleagues in the Department of State and colleagues in the Guyman Show have done their best to keep this relationship stable at a very difficult time. But because of this re-rise of China, because of the difficulties emanating from North Korea, because of the dynamism of Asia, and because of broader security concerns, and yes, I mean Iran and others, staying in the same place is not sufficient anymore. Being stable is not sufficient. We've got to move forward. And from our point of view, for an alliance such as ours to exist and thrive, we have to approach it from the perspective of a Tier 1 nation. Now, what do I mean by this? From our point of view, a Tier 1 nation is a nation that has economic weight, capable military forces, global vision, and is willing to take leadership on international concerns. Now, it's clear as you read our report that we think the U.S. can better support this alliance, and we should do so. But there is not a question, I think, in the minds of most of you, and certainly none of us, about the fact that the United States is going to be a Tier 1 nation and will continue to be a Tier 1 nation. For Japan, however, it's time for a decision. Japan has a decision to make. And that is, does Japan continue as a Tier 1 nation? Or are they content to drift into Tier 2 status? And if the Tier 2 is okay with the people of Japan and the government of Japan, I recommend you close the report. Don't read any further. There's no need. From our point of view, we say that Japan is capable of remaining a Tier 1 nation, but we have questions about Japan's disposition. Does she care to do this? The U.S. needs a strong Japan. We believe Japan needs a strong U.S. And for Japan to remain standing shoulder to shoulder with the United States, she's going to have to move forward with us. And you will see at the very end of our report that we have recommendations for the United States, recommendations for Japan, and recommendations for our alliance. Let me read from Joe Nye the following and then turn things over to Mike Green. He's asked me to say the following. For nearly 2 decades, I've had the pleasure of working with Rich Armitage to promote our shared view that the United States alliance with Japan is the essential bedrock of a stable and prosperous East Asia. This is the third in a series of bipartisan reports that are designed to develop better understanding of the importance of that relationship to the United States, to Japan, and to the world. And we are appealing to Americans to rise above any partisanship in reaffirming the importance of our relationship with Japan, and to our Japanese friends to elevate their sights in thinking about strengthening Japan's positive role over the long term. Some of our recommendations will be welcome, others not. But all are offered in the spirit of friendship and concern for our future together. Thank you. Mike?
Thank you all for coming. Let me say 2 things before we turn to the specific assessments and recommendations. First, what distinguishes this report and the 2 reports that this group produced previously in 2000 and 2007 is the premise that the United States, as an Asia-Pacific power, is right to anchor its strategy in an alliance with the major maritime power on the western side of the Pacific, Japan. And that this is not a question of choosing between Japan and China, between Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia, but it's really about how you approach the whole region, which is why in 2007 the title of the report was U.S.-Japan Alliance Getting Asia Right. To get Asia right, we had to get the alliance right. And this has, I think, a long pedigree in American strategic thought towards Asia. 200 years ago, in the midst of the War of 1812, Captain David Porter on the USS Essex was cut off from the eastern seaboard by the Royal Navy, and he called his officers together and announced the audacious plan to round the Cape and attack British shipping in the Pacific. It was the first U.S. warship ever to enter the Pacific. And merchants from New York and Boston knew about trade with China, but Porter came back and said, as a maritime power, we've got to anchor our presence in a relationship with the other maritime nation, Japan. That influenced Commodore Perry, which in turn influenced Alfred Thayer Mahan, the great naval strategist. In the midst of World War II, Joseph Grew and others argued that we did not need a punitive peace. We needed a peace where Japan would be an anchor of stability. And our Cold War alliances were premised on that. And when Rich Armitage was Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense during the Reagan administration, the maritime strategy for dealing with the expansion of the Soviets was also premised on this maritime approach to the region. And when Joe Nye took over the Assistant Secretary job in the 1990s, it became administration policy and has been a bipartisan approach ever since in the Clinton, Bush, and now Obama administrations. And it's a recognition of our role as an Asia-Pacific power, but importantly as a maritime power. So that's the premise from which we started these reports. The second point is that the United States has an interest in friendship with Japan, alignment with Japan, but we have a national interest in Japan being, as Secretary Armitage said, a first-tier power. And one of the assumptions we brought into this report was that Japan can achieve that objective, that there are untapped sources of power in Japan that would unleash sources of influence on the international scene. Japan, for example, in the area of what Joe and I would call soft power, is a first-tier superpower. I just finished a poll with the Chicago Council on Global Affairs we'll be announcing soon. Japan in the United States is the most trusted country in the world after the UK and Canada, in that poll and in many others. In BBC polling, Japan is consistently ranked number 1, 2, or 3 in the world in terms of respect. Samsung Economic Research Institute does a global survey on national brands around the world. Japan was number 2, and after March 11th, 2011, and the response moved up to number 1. So in soft power, Japan has enormous potential. How you tap that is a hard operational and policy problem, but it's there. The self-defense forces are a resource that has not been sufficiently utilized. Today, in Japanese polling, the self-defense forces are usually listed as the most trusted institution in Japan. The resources and capabilities are there, and as we suggest in our report, loosening some of the constraints would give a real asset to Japan and the world. The role of women. Goldman Sachs has done studies that suggest in their modeling that if Japan had a participation in the workforce at the OECD level by women, that GDP growth would increase on an annual basis by something like 0.3%, which is quite considerable. And trade. Korea, for example, has 36% of its trade covered under free trade agreements. Real dynamism in the Korean economy. For Japan, the number is roughly 16%. So joining into free trade agreements, not just the FTA or the TPP or the scheme that David Asher will describe, but a variety of free trade agreements would unleash competitive forces in the Japanese economy and give Japan real influence in shaping regional trade and financial architecture. It's not just about TPP and the bilateral economic relationship with the U.S. It's about Japan empowering itself economically and internationally by being a leader in forming trade agreements. So these are some of the areas, and there are others, where despite the well-known challenges Japan has with demographics, with energy and so forth, there's some real potential. And part of our purpose here is to try to explain why it is in U.S. interest. Japan will make the choice, but why it's in U.S. interest that that potential be tapped.
Thank you. Thank you, Secretary Armitage. Good morning. The importance of energy in our economies, each of our economies, and our national security is often overlooked, but cannot be overstated. And it is something we really took on board when our group did this project. In the context of the U.S.-Japanese alliance, we identified several major energy challenges and opportunities that are emerging, and I'd like to briefly review the 4 of them. First, nuclear power. We are very mindful of the tragedies of March 11th, 2011, and extend our deepest condolences to the victims of those afflicted by the earthquake, the tsunami, and then the subsequent nuclear shutdown. The Fukushima disaster has set back the cause of civilian nuclear power in Japan and elsewhere. However, we applaud Prime Minister Noda's brave and wise decision to initiate a cautious restart with 2 OI reactors restarted so far. Before Fukushima, Japan was the world's third largest consumer of nuclear energy for good reason. Nuclear power remains the only substantial source of emissions-free baseload electricity generation. Its resumption is critical for Japan to sustain economic growth and meet its emissions reduction goals. The nuclear shutdown is starting to reverse Japan's extraordinary progress over time in reducing its oil use. From the 1970s, 80% of Japan's energy use was oil. It's been driven down to 42% in 2010. Last month, fuel oil consumption in Japan's 10 largest regional utilities is up 64% over a year ago, burning more oil to replace those electrons that nuclear no longer does. A permanent nuclear shutdown would also stymie responsible international development of civilian nuclear power. As China plans to join Russia, South Korea, and France as major vendors of nuclear power plants, Japan cannot afford to fall behind. These plants will be built all over the world, and the world will benefit from Japan's efficient, reliable, and safe reactors and nuclear services. For our part, the United States, we need to remove uncertainties surrounding the disposal of nuclear waste, improve our permitting processes, and together, Tokyo and Washington must take on board the lessons of Fukushima and resume world leadership promoting safe reactor designs and sound regulatory practices. Second issue, natural gas. One thing I've enjoyed in my career in energy is how it can surprise you. Who would have thought a few years ago we would be talking about the United States as a major exporter of natural gas? Not many of us, I assure you. But large increases in U.S. natural gas reserves, mainly due to hydraulic fracturing being deployed in our shale gas plays, has turned the United States into the world's fastest growing producer of natural gas and makes substantial exports possible. In fact, the lower 48 will begin exporting LNG in 2016. And the IEA says when we widen the Panama Canal in 2014, it will allow 80% of the LNG tanker fleet to pass through there and supply competitive priced gas to Asia. The opportunity here is obvious. Japan needs the natural gas, and we have it. Our two countries started natural gas trade, LNG trade in 1969, and going forward, the United States can and should increase its exports to Japan. Three things are necessary. First, the United States must reject calls to limit exports of LNG. This is not a time for resource nationalism. It's time for a resource alliance. We should not be inhibiting private sector plans to build LNG export projects. Next, the United States should put Japan on a level playing field with other potential international customers for our LNG. Finally, in a time of crisis for Japan, the United States should guarantee no interruption in LNG supplies, barring a national emergency, at previously negotiated commercial terms. Third area we discussed was protecting international energy security and the global energy commons. Like it or not, the vitality of modern civilization and future global growth will depend on increasing access to flows of fossil fuels, especially oil, for a long time. Even as the U.S. and North America become less dependent on imports, the world economy will still rely heavily on energy supplies from the Persian Gulf, which holds nearly half the world's proven oil reserves. The Persian Gulf is also a crucial supplier of LNG. Qatar's Ras Laffan liquefaction facility supplies 1/3 of global LNG supplies. As China and other industrialized nations follow in our footsteps and become major importers of waterborne crude from the Middle East, global peace and prosperity will depend on the stability of that region and the security of the sea lanes in between it and our respective markets. Japan joined anti-piracy missions off Somalia in 2009. This year, she cut imports from Iran by over 1/3 in the first 5 months in compliance with U.S. sanctions. Going forward, Tokyo's increased participation in multinational efforts to combat piracy, protect Persian Gulf shipping, confront regional threats to peace, such as currently posed by Iran's nuclear program, and to secure the sea lanes will be needed and welcome. Fourth and final area, methane hydrates. And now this is a little bit longer term and aspirational. Methane hydrates are natural gas crystals trapped in deeply buried ice formations. Deposits off of south-central Japan are estimated at 10 years of Japanese domestic consumption. Globally, the resource has been estimated to be as high as 700,000 trillion cubic feet, well over 100 times the current proven global natural gas reserves. Like shale gas several years ago, we know it's there, but we haven't figured out how to get it out of the Earth's crust safely and cost-effectively. However, these are technical problems that countries with the skill and the motivation can eventually solve. Japan and the United States cooperate closely in research and development of potential large-scale methane hydrate production. In May, a U.S.-Japan field trial in Alaska's North Slope successfully extracted methane hydrates by pumping in and sequestering CO2, demonstrating both energy security and environmental benefits. In light of the transformational potential, the United States and Japan should accelerate progress on researching and developing cost-effective and environmentally responsible production of methane hydrates. In sum, a cautious restart of nuclear power, a new chapter in our bilateral natural gas trade, enhanced protection of the global commons, and methane hydrates appear to our group as worthy and promising areas for our alliance to deepen and succeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Bob. Can I ask Kevin?
Thank you, and my gratitude both to CSIS for hosting us and to you for organizing this effort again. In trying to say where we are now in the global economy and comparing it to the moment when we were last together in 2008, what a difference 4 years make. We were in the trough of a U.S. financial crisis that had morphed into a global economic crisis with the unthinkable happening, an actual contraction in world trade. You look at where we are now, and while it's certainly not the optimum moment in the U.S. and the global economy, I note that we've got the lowest U.S. consumer debt in decades. The U.S. exports have increased some 43% and are on target, perhaps, to hit President Obama's aspirational 50% growth in U.S. exports. American companies today, as opposed to 4 years ago, are sitting on top of more cash than at any time in history since 1963, positioned to take advantage of economic growth. Bob has described a very dynamic energy situation. I would submit that there's at least as much dynamism in the manufacturing sector, where 3D printing and other technologies are offering significant promise to the two countries in the world that are the absolute leaders in innovation and productivity, the U.S. and Japan. So the question is, what do we do with this now? How do we step out of the shadow of 2008, and where do we take our shared future? Well, as we sat to assay both the trade and investment picture, and I should say on the investment side, we've seen some largely unchronicled movement in investment. To my mind, that's very, very important. Since 98 to 2010, the last year for which the numbers are available, we've seen basically a doubling of U.S. investment in Japan. That's really good news. We haven't seen corresponding movements back this direction, but what's clear is underneath the surface for companies, when we wring our hands about some features of the relationship, that neuralgia and that anxiety are not shared by a lot of corporations. They see the promise and they want to act on it. And as we started to assess this and try to come up with some recommendations, David Asher challenged us not to think about just, to use the oldest metaphor in trade, how to keep the bicycle upright and moving forward, but how to create a new paradigm that not only operated the U.S. and Japanese advantage, but significantly improved the outlook for trade liberalization for the region. And I'm going to ask David to talk about where that thought experiment took it.
Yeah, well, thank you very much. Japan is a nation in a period of great challenge, but there is tremendous prospect for opportunity, economic development, advancement. Japan is a country that has really never tapped into its service sector liberalization prospects. So as a country that faces the most rapidly declining working population, aging society, debt and deficit, we frequently look at the dark, prospects that Japan may face, but we don't pay attention to the opportunities for Japan to advance its state and society and economy. And we forget that Japan is still the second largest economic partner for the United States, especially if you account for Japan's production in China. The Amitage-Nye report recommends a comprehensive economic, energy, and security agreement between the U.S. and Japan that would really cement the relationship, not just between the U.S., Japan economies, but between Canada, Mexico, and the North American Free Trade Zone. The context of this is that Japan already has a free trade agreement with Mexico. Japan has announced in March a agreement that it will negotiate for free trade with Canada. And there really is no reason why the United States should be left out of this process. So we see as a opportunity for Japan to address its long-term investment and economic prosperity needs by creating a much deeper, stronger relationship with the U.S. And taking advantage also of the huge economic opportunities for investment here. Returns on capital in the U.S. are very strong. Returns on capital in Japan are unfortunately rather low. We see a free trade agreement as a way of increasing the anshinkan, the sense of confidence between our countries, that will allow Japanese investment to flow into the U.S. And North America writ large in a much more unfettered fashion. We also particularly see an opportunity for Japan to invest in the energy sector. Bob McNally talked about natural gas and methane anhydrates. The U.S. is actually awash in natural gas. Prices are washed out. There is relatively little investment going on right now because of this asymmetry. Japanese companies have an opportunity that they're already taking advantage of in Canada, but I think can also take advantage of in the United States itself to increase their investment. But the U.S. has to change its policy. We need to make sure that Japan can invest with security and safety in the North American natural gas and energy opportunities, and the only way to really do that is through a free trade agreement. So the bottom line is that free trade is not as complicated an equation for Japan to solve as people think. The working population among farmers in Japan is alarmingly in decline. The agriculture issues, which people have said have been blocking free trade for years, are really not that substantial. Japan has negotiated free trade agreements with many countries. The United States is, that people thought they couldn't, including Mexico. I think that we need to finally break the barrier, the sound barrier of free trade with Japan, and move forward in a way that will undergird our alliance for the next 50 to 100 years.
Thank you, David. Torkel, would you make a few comments about relations with neighbors, please?
Thank you. I will. I just want to say I really like that soundbite David gave about breaking the sound barrier in U.S.-Japan free trade relations. The section I'm speaking about is robust U.S. and Japan and ROK relations. And the main point of this section is that the U.S., Japan, and Korea share extremely important trilateral national interests. It's hard to place on the U.S. agenda two issues that are as important, although there are several, but two issues that are as important as how do we together approach the re-rise of China, and how do we deal with the issues of North Korea. These are very difficult issues that are key to the stability of Asia and peace in the region, and the growing friendship between the United States and China, and Japan and Korea and China. And we really have to focus on these issues together, and we can't achieve our common interests and goals unless we all work together. There are lots of areas to build trilateral cooperation. We've talked about energy cooperation. Japan, in the midst of its nuclear incident and the issues resulting from that, and the cutback from its nuclear power position, may be tempted to not recognize its very important worldwide role in the promotion of non-proliferation and the safety of nuclear power. Japan's role in that is well recognized and respected around the world, and for Japan to retreat from that position and not move forward there would be a big mistake. Likewise, South Korea has important nuclear safety track record and a role of transparency, and together the three countries, the United States, Korea, and Japan, can make significant progress in continuing to promote and assure the safety of nuclear power, and also our continued commitment to nonproliferation. A second area is overseas development assistance, where the United States, Japan, and Korea are world leaders and where we share common interests, and Japan and Korea have been very supportive and instrumental in promoting objectives common to us, including in Iraq and Afghanistan, and this area of cooperation can continue to be a model. The third area, and we'll get into more detail on that, is U.S.-Japan security cooperation and with Korea. And there's been a lot of bilateral activity going on between Korea and Japan below the radar screen that can be built and promoted and encouraged, and together we can move forward. Having cross-servicing agreements between the two countries, Japan and Korea, and also having a sharing of information assurance between the two countries will go a long way towards promoting the interoperability and cooperative spirit that we share. As in myself, in my own life, I'm really a product of the Korean War, literally and figuratively. My parents met in Japan because of the Korean War. They were married in Japan, and I was made in Korea. I was conceived in Busan. I wasn't born there, but born in America. But this, I think I can really empathize with Japan and Korea, with all the emotion that goes on between the two countries over their national interests. And I think from both sides, both countries have legitimate stakes and legitimate questions involving historical claims. But it's more than that. It's really emotion and feeling. It's really gets at the depth of what it means to be Japanese and what it means to be Korean. And these are very difficult issues which the United States cannot get in the middle of and resolve. These are issues that need to be really looked at and addressed by the people themselves. And for us to expect that the Japanese government or the Korean government are going to go against their public opinion and take some kind of enlightened position on this, I think is a little bit far-fetched, given the media encouragement of these entrenched and very heartfelt and strong positions. But what we're asking for in this report is that maybe we look at encouraging the Track 2 dialogues that exist between the countries, where historians get together and really talk and resolve and get a point of consensus where people can talk openly and directly to each other and broaden this into a public understanding of this. And why are we interested in this? We're interested in this as people that are facing a very difficult future in Northeast Asia, and we need to go forward together, the United States, Japan, and Korea. We need to move forward together to address these issues. Thank you.
Thank you, Torkel. Randy, could you enlighten us on the re-rise of China, please?
Thank you. Just a few comments on China. As Secretary Armitage noted up front, it really is the backdrop to everything we're talking about. Certainly informs the administration's policies. We wouldn't probably be talking about a pivot or a rebalance if China wasn't on the current trajectory we believe she's on, and certainly our report would look a lot different. So this is really a central theme that's sort of thread throughout the report. We note that the history of the alliance has been very favorable for China. In fact, in part, China's meteoric rise was made possible by the peace and stability and the regional presence that our alliance has provided. And we believe that will continue to be the case in the future. So, there, of course, this is an implicit rejection of what we hear from some Chinese friends, that the alliance is no longer appropriate for regional security going forward. We think China can continue to benefit from the alliance as long as we continue to have the right mix of both hedging and engagement. And that's really what our policy has been historically, both as respective countries having this blend of hedging and engagement, but also as an alliance. Going forward, this will continue to be the case, but that means that certain capabilities will have to be both maintained and acquired, and that our policies will have to continue to be closely coordinated. So the notion of keeping this blend appropriate and right of hedging and engaging means that we need a dynamic process in our alliance to talk about necessary capabilities to talk about policy coordination. I think recently there has been a lot of focus on the hedging part of this, and I think that's largely driven by China's behavior and some of China's policies. We note in the report concern about China's statements about possibly expanding their core interests to include not only Xinjiang, Tibet, and Taiwan, but now possibly South China Sea. But irrespective of whether or not it's officially a new core interest, we certainly can just observe the behavior itself, the more assertive and at times aggressive approaches to some of the sovereignty disputes in the region. Of course, on top of that is the lack of transparency in China's military modernization and some of its strategic intentions. So for as far as the eye can see, this hedging portion of our alliance approach will need to be sustained. Certainly, we also note in the report that China's trajectory upward is not 100% assured. China faces extraordinary challenges, and we list several in the report. These would not be unknown to you, but the energy situation and the increasing demand that China faces, the environmental degradation, the widening income gap, the demographic challenges, and of course the cross-cutting issue that really challenges China, corruption. All will make China's rise all the more difficult to sustain going forward. The other big question, of course, is about the economy of China. Questions about whether China can achieve its own stated goals of transitioning from an export-driven growth model to one that's more driven by internal consumption. The jury is definitely still out on that. And in fact, more recent signs have really shown that China is sticking to the old playbook. The recent moves on the currency, of course, are designed to increase exports. That's the model that they've succeeded on so far. Transitioning away from that could create winners and losers, could create political tension that China doesn't certainly need right now with its leadership transition coming up. But at any point going forward, it's a difficult transition for China to make. So again, just to close, the alliance, we believe, will continue to be of benefit to China and China's own stated goals, as long as this mix of hedging and engagement is done correctly and appropriately, and that requires the acquisition of certain capabilities, which I think SAC will talk a little bit about, but it also involves a very dynamic process of consultation and policy coordination.
Thank you, Randy. SAC, the security issues, if you please.
Thank you. Good morning, and I want to add my thanks to CSIS for being a big part of this, but also to Secretary Armitage and Joe Nye for having me be a part of this panel. The security section of the report addresses 6 sections: interoperability, research and development technology, cybersecurity, extended deterrence, prohibition of collective self-defense, and finally peacekeeping, of which Isabella Mrasaskowski will address following me. I think, as my colleagues have made clear, the security environment that Japan and the alliance must deal with has significantly changed. You know, at one time, the alliance focused on the defense of Japan. There was a roles and missions review in the 80s, the early 80s, that changed that expanded the thinking, or the area of interest for Japan and the alliance, and it expanded it north, south, and strengthened or added roles and missions to what operationally the alliance could do. That was followed up by a review of roles and missions, specifically the guidelines review in the late 90s, which added the other roles and missions for especially regional security. And so the trend is pretty clear. And the trend is also that the distinction between the defense of Japan and regional security is very thin. I think now that when you look and you consider what Japan's national interests and the scope of regional interests are, it goes north, further south, and much further to the west. And we would argue that it goes as far west as the Middle East. And if you can imagine that the Strait of Hormuz were closed, or if there were a military contingency in the South China Sea, that would have a pretty significant effect on the security and stability of Japan. And so that thinking needs to become more and more a part of the context of the alliance. In that regard, I won't go through all of the recommendations, but let me highlight some specific ones as we go through the security section. At the first sign of any closure of the Strait of Hormuz, Japan should unilaterally dispatch minesweepers to the region. Right now, the U.S. and Japan, through OSD and Japan's MOD, as well as MOFA and State Department, are considering proceeding with the roles, missions, and capabilities dialogue. That dialogue should include extending and strengthening intel, surveillance, and reconnaissance, or ISR capabilities further to the extent of going down to and including the South China Seas. We also recommend that USFJ should become more an operational headquarters. And I'll speak a little bit more about that when we get to the last section of prohibition of collective self-defense. But in that regard, USFJ should be given more specific responsibilities, operational, mission-oriented responsibilities for the defense of Japan. And at the base or at the foundation of this dialogue that OSD, well, let me just say that both governments are about to have on roles, missions, and capabilities should be addressing more intimate service-to-service cooperation as we move forward. I used to be at the at OSD, Office of Secretary of Defense, Japan Policy Desk, with Paul Giara, who I sit over there. And Paul was a Navy officer, and I was an Army officer. And he would lord over me how close, how intimate, how effective the Navy-to-Navy relationship was in Japan. And as an Army officer, of course, that bugged me. But he was right. And the Navy-to-Navy relationship in our alliance is the model, and it's been that way for decades. The air-to-air and U.S. Army, Marine Corps, and Japan Ground Self-Defense Forces relationship needs to be much closer. They need to catch up to that. It should be much more intimate, and Japan and especially the USMC have a lot to share when it comes to things like amphibious operations and capabilities. Let me switch now to research and development. I'm sorry, before I depart, with regard to the sword and the shield analogy for roles and missions, that is an overly simplistic way of outlining what the alliance should be doing. It fails to address the offensive responsibilities that Japan should have when it comes to the defense of Japan. And so that relates to the amphibious operations capability, but other areas as well when it comes to the defense of Japan. Now let me transition to the R&D. Especially in this environment of shrinking resources, we need to become more effective as alliance partners. And this is one way to do that. Japan has recently adjusted its arms export principles, and that's a welcome change. But the thing is, the alliance has yet been able to figure out how to implement that. How do we move forward with that change that opens up new opportunities? One way is pretty obvious, and that is we should open up the pipe of Japan exporting technologies and military arms, and we should welcome that on the U.S. side. The days of U.S. concern of Japan threatening our military industries and defense industries, excuse me, are really past, and we need to open up that pipe. But a different area is one that missile defense is really emblematic in my mind. where both sides took a very complicated, very expensive program and found a way to have co-development, co-production, and co-employment of the system. We need to find more areas for those kinds of opportunities. With regard to cybersecurity, the U.S. Side has established a cybersecurity command. That is not yet something that Japan has, and we should find a way to establish a joint cybersecurity center where we focus on research and also an exchange of information to stay up to date with those challenges. With regard to extended deterrence, let me make a couple remarks. Deterrence includes or requires two obvious factors. One is capability, and the other one is credibility. That's kind of the standard and the concept of deterrence. But with extended deterrence and with an ally, we need to continue to work on the assurance that the U.S. provides Japan, and that requires a dialogue of what direction that thinking is going in on the U.S. side, and we need to continue to do that. Now, with regard to the prohibition on collective self-defense, let me raise as backdrop 3/11 and Operation Tomodachi and how U.S. and Japan deployed forces. Both sides, we believe, rightfully recognize that crisis as one of humanitarian assistance and disaster relief, and specifically did not have a component of an external adversary that we had to deal with regard to defense. And so swept away the prohibitions on collective self-defense and worked much more intimately on how to get the job done. A couple examples are U.S. warships went to Hokkaido and moved Japan ground self-defense forces from Hokkaido to northeast Japan, to Tohoku. Another example is how both forces worked to make operational the airfield in Sendai, which became the center of how to provide relief and response in the crisis to that area. And those are great examples. But it also shows, it also brings out an irony. And the irony is we did well in an HADR scenario, an HADR crisis, by sweeping away the prohibitions on collective self-defense. But in a scenario where it's much more severe, where there's an adversary that we have to deal with, we're prohibited from that kind of intimate cooperation. And the recommendation is we should find authorities, Japan should find authorities to allow both forces to deal more intimately without the constraints that prohibition of collective self-defense brings to the operational forces. And that should apply to the full security spectrum that forces must deal with, which means peacetime, tension, crisis, and war. And so that's another strong recommendation that we raise. And with that, let me pass to Isabella to address peacekeeping operations.
Thank you, Zach. Thank you to CSAS for hosting us, and thank you, Secretary Armitage, for hosting this report. Dr. Green mentioned that the self-defense forces are one of the most trusted institutions in all of Japan. However, Japan is the only country in the world that regards weapons use during a peacekeeping operations as an exercise of military force. Currently, there is a bill to possibly revise the peacekeeping operation law. The current law doesn't allow SDF to use weapons use only for the case of self-defense or when danger is imminent. The new bill would revise this to allow the self-defense forces during a peacekeeping operation to defend civilians outside of a peacekeeping operation area. This essentially would supplement the security of the host nation, and it's likely that this bill might not make it to the Diet's current session, and it's likely that it might get watered down. Our study group and the participants of this report recommend that a more forward-leaning revision to this law. We recommend that Japan not only defend civilians in danger, but also protect and defend, with force if necessary, other international peacekeepers from other nationalities. We believe that, I mean, Japan is currently on self-defense, on peacekeeping operation missions in Haiti, working on disaster reconstruction and humanitarian assistance. Specifically, right now they're containing infectious diseases. And this mission was extended till 2013. They're in the Golan Heights. They're in South Sudan, the world's youngest nation. They're also in Djibouti on an anti-piracy mission. We believe that Japan's self-defense forces on these peacekeeping operations are making tremendous international contributions. And the law should reflect that. So with that, we hope that the bill does go through and that it is a little bit more forward-leaning. So thank you.
Thank you, Isabella. And I'm going to turn it over to you in just a moment. I just want to make a very brief concluding remark. It should be obvious to all of you that at least this panel does not believe that decline in Japan is a foregone conclusion. Mike has already mentioned several of the hidden strengths that Japan has, if Japan will employ them. Still a large economy, an economy that can be made even more robust if there was reform, particularly regulatory reform and competition. If there was more openness, free trade, as we've suggested in our report, immigration change, greater participation by women in the workforce, that'd also add a lot. The national brand that Mike discussed of Japan is fantastic. Let's use it. Let's get some oxygen from it. Let's have some pride in it. Your allies take pride in the fact that Japan has such a robust and well-developed national brand. And as was alluded, the self-defense force is now the most trusted organization in Japan. Operation Tomodachi actually bought us some time. We did our duty. We supported our allies through that terrible tragedy. But Operation Tomodachi will not carry us through the challenges of the future. And it ought to be clear to all of you that we hold a very strong view that the world is made safer and more humane by the United States and Japan, which are robust, strong democracies. And further, that we have the greatest possibility of a peaceful re-rise of China if that re-rise takes part, or takes place in an area of strong, vibrant democracies. And in that regard, we also include the Republic of Korea, and of course Indonesia, and Australia, and India. Look, we want Japan and the United States who have come to the conclusion that we can share some, not only the burden, but we can share some of the decision making. We want a Japanese hand on the tiller along with us. We know who we are and what we are, but we can be very much assisted by a strong and vibrant Japan, a Japan which is a place in which young Japanese can actually dream and not just exist. So we've got a lot in the report. We've thrown a lot out at you. I'm going to hush up and except to try to respond to questions, or someone up here will respond to questions. Turn it over to Mike Green, and he will identify people, and we'll pass you the microphones, and we'll get on with this.
We have, we have microphones around the room. Let me quickly thank Nick Sanchini and the Japan Chair staff, and Ellen Kim and the Korea Chair staff for getting us organized in the middle of the summer. So put your hand up. I'll call on you. Identify yourself. You can direct it to the panel in general or to someone. Yeah, microphone troops right here.
Shu Ling with Zuowei Times. My question is, if the tension over the Senkaku Island arises, and to defend Japan as is obligated by the alliance treaty, will U.S. risk confronting or conflicting with China? And if it will, is it prepared for the consequences? Thank you.
Let me put this in context. We are, under our treaty obligations, required to defend the administrative territories under the jurisdiction of Japan, and that includes the Senkakus. But it's impossible to answer a question like that, and the reason is what is the issue? What is happening? Does something happen because Japan is acting in a provocative way? Has Japan changed the status quo in a large way? That might prompt one sort of response from the United States. If in a wanton way, Japan, the Senkakus, areas under the jurisdiction of Japan, were attacked, that might have another response. But it's impossible to answer that hypothetically. However, it is very much in the U.S. interest to make sure that we exert every ounce of our influence to keep that event from occurring. And I think that's where the diplomatic energy of the United States is going to be applied.
Okay, thank you. Yes, sir, right here.
Hi, my name is Avi Pant. I'm in the U.S. Navy. We've talked a little bit about some legal changes for a more expansive definition of what the self-defense force can do. But what I haven't heard so much is, well, I understand for historical reasons it is a self-defense force, but why not a unified command? Why not take the brakes off of the force completely and let them really be a full-on military? What are the concerns that we might have in doing that, given our current considerations?
Well, we make it quite clear in our report, as we have in the past, that first of all, the decision to remove Article 9 is a Japanese decision, not a U.S. decision. But we further describe this as an impediment, the Article 9 prohibition as an impediment to alliance cooperation. That is, I don't think one can argue that fact. We also have an interesting footnote in our report. And the footnote refers to the 2006 Yanai Commission, which was put together to study the whole question of Article 9 collective self-defense. And they came to the conclusion that a prime minister could, by fiat, do away with the prohibition of collective self-defense. The United States would be fine with that. It's not us holding it together or holding it down.
Let me just add a little bit, and that is, the goal is to have more intimate cooperation so that we can work together better than dealing with the constraints now. We are not, that's the goal. We are not seeking changes to the Constitution. We're not seeking unified command, for example. We're not seeking for Japan to become a more militaristic in character. And so the aim is we need to get rid of the impediment so that our forces can work together more efficiently, more effectively. That's the goal.
Hello, I'm Phil Carrata from the State Department's Public Diplomacy Bureau. Phil Carrata, State Department's Public Diplomacy Bureau. If Japan does not choose to step up to the plate and lets the alliance wither, what are the most plausible consequences that you're concerned about? Thank you.
Let me make sure I understand your question. If Japan and the United States aren't moving forward together, what are the consequences?
Yeah, if the alliance withers, what do you think is...
Well, look, we're going to have an alliance because one of the most important features of our alliance is the fact that the government of Japan and the people of Japan allow us the use of military bases in Japan, without which the tyranny of time and distance for our Navy would be such that it would really make it difficult for us to have meaningful security cooperation. So I think as long as the government of Japan were willing to allow the use of U.S. bases, that our alliance would continue. But it won't be what we need it to be. It won't have the vibrancy, and it's not something, I think, my colleagues can answer for themselves, it's not something that is, if Japan doesn't move along, that is not a situation that's actually supportive of the people of Japan. I use the term deliberately. We want a Japan in which young Japanese can dream, not just exist. We want a Japan which is not so, what would you say, uchimuki, inward-looking. That's the Japan we need, and I think the Americans of this panel think that's the kind of Japan that Japan should need and want as well.
I would just add, I do not personally think that we're at a fork in the road where the alternatives are a robust, strong U.S.-Japan alliance or a divorce and a collapse of the alliance. In some ways, we're talking about an alliance that muddles and drifts, because there is broad consensus in both countries that we need each other. So it's either that path or the robust alliance. And I think if we end up on the path of continued muddle and some drift, several things could happen. One is, I think that the U.S. and other powers that are aligned closely with Japan are going to start hedging. And that will weaken Japan's influence, and frankly, it will take some of the energy out of the jointness and cooperation we need for both of our countries to be more influential. So it would be an unfortunate outcome. It would not be in U.S. interests, would certainly not be in Japan's interest, but that's one danger. The other danger, it seems to me, is you could create at a time of shifting power in Asia the impression that there are fissures, there are cracks, there are vacuums, and at a time when you want to discourage countries from trying to unilaterally change the order we now benefit from, when you want to discourage countries from resorting to force, coercion, mercantilism, at just that time, that's the worst possible time to create the impression that one of the most important bulwarks of stability, support for democracy, and an open and inclusive trading system in the region is going wobbly. So it's not so much a binary, love or divorce choice. It's how much we're able to continue maximizing the benefits to each of our national interests and regional stability. Kevin?
Just to say, I don't believe there was any subtext in this report or its two predecessors of alliance at some essential risk. I do think in this third exercise, one thing that became clear in our conversations, at least to me, was that among the greatest threats is a failure of imagination on the economic side. To be blunt, we look at the energy that's spent on free trade agreements and even on the TPP process, which, to be clear, I think is terrific, has a lot of authenticity and might well be the next thing that keeps the open trade regime in the Pacific on track. But I note with interest, and frankly, I'm simply puzzled by the idea of a Japan, Korea, China FTA. Really? Really? I saw that announcement 2 months ago, and I was trying to figure out how does that work, as my 19-year-old daughter would say. It's frankly puzzling. We at a time when I see Ira Shapiro sitting here and Meredith Broadbent, who are I shiver because they're authentic experts in the global trade regime. When there's no next obvious thing for us to spend time and energy, I think, diverted from the largest free trade agreement in the world, NAFTA, and adding and enriching confidence and habits of cooperation with Japan in terms of what's next, what's achievable, and what bolsters the alliance. That seems an obvious and important bit of signaling that for the rest of the region, currently in doubt because of the background noise from Europe about the future of export growth, well, that could be, we think, vitally important signaling.
On energy, were our alliance to wither, I can think of at least one opportunity Japan would forfeit and one additional risk it would take on. What we're suggesting is that we leverage the alliance to remove Japan's second-class status when it comes to being a customer for our LNG exports. Were our alliance to wither, I think that opportunity would go away. And also with regard to, again, Japan's growing dependence on the stability of the Middle East and the secure flow of hydrocarbons from the Middle East to Asia, were our alliance to wither, we would lose the opportunity to fully utilize all Japan's assets there, and it would frankly exacerbate this tension you start to see in the United States, this pernicious potential for resource nationalism. As our imports go down and America starts to realize we have all this oil and gas under our feet, we could be, some people believe, self-sufficient, our hemisphere anyway, in 10 years, starts to revive this sense that we don't need the Middle East. We don't need to be sending troops and spending blood, treasure, and and prestige abroad. And I think a weakening alliance with Japan would reinforce that sense of resource nationalism, even isolationism, which could come as a result of the abundance we're discovering here in our hemisphere of energy.
Good question. You got everyone spun up. Yes.
My name is Kunio Kikuchi, and I'm with Washington Research and Analysis. My question is about nuclear energy, Bob. I'm a little surprised that you can blithely recommend restart of nuclear plants in Japan when we still don't know what's happened and what's happening in Fukushima. After all, I think U.S. should be more engaged because these are U.S. designed and some of them are built General Electric plants which in retrospect have flawed designs. And I say flawed design because it self-destructs when the plumbing fails, nothing else, just the circulation of water for whatever reason fails, it melts down within 24 hours, and then it contaminates the environment for the remaining 30 years. And this could happen in the US too. And so I think United States should pay more attention. Japan should have a scenario of not that the plants are safe, but what to do should the plants melt down the way Fukushima did. And this, again, I think is something that US should also be concerned as much as the Japanese, except that Japan cannot afford the loss of 900 to 1,000 square miles of real estate the way US might be able to afford it. Thank you.
Your point is well taken, sir, and I did not mean to, I hope my remarks did not sound blithe. If you read our report, and certainly what I hope to convey is that we applauded the cautious restart that Prime Minister Noda has begun, only 2 reactors down. We understand Japan is setting up a new regulatory agency that will take on board the lessons of Fukushima and ensure that when other restarts happen, it can be done safely. So we very much are just applauding what Prime Minister Noda has done. A cautious restart is entirely appropriate. But again, we would go back to the fact that nuclear energy is the only emissions-free baseload source of baseload electricity generation. And we don't see, and I think Prime Minister Noda and his government, I think most thoughtful observers on Japan's economic future would agree that without a restart of safe nuclear power, it's hard to see Japan reviving its national economy, sustaining its economic growth, much less becoming that tier 1 partner that Secretary Armitage is talking about.
Let me just add, Kikuchi-san, my understanding is that none of the reports commissioned by the government or independently in Japan concluded that the GE design was the cause of the problem. However, I do agree with your general point that the U.S. and Japan should be doing a lot more in this space to think about the future of nuclear safety. Japan played a big role after 3 Mile Island, sending engineers and experts to help us at a really critical time. A lot of U.S. engineers from GE, from Department of Energy and NRC have been in Japan. We didn't go into detail on this in our report, but it seems to me one area where really we could step up is in learning from the experience and then together with other like-minded states, Korea for example, pushing for higher levels of nuclear safety globally at a time when we're looking at a future where most reactors in the world are going to be built by Russia, China, and other countries that may not have our same standards. So there is you're right, there's an opportunity there as we go forward. Yes, Secretary of War Stanton.
Good morning, Paul Giara. This question is for David Asher, but anyone else who wants to respond. It seems to me that the alliance is in pretty good shape, but obviously it can't afford to stand still, particularly in the context of so many game changers, the militarized rise of China being first and foremost. With the relaxation of the 3 arms export control principles, David, how can you see that changing as a game changer, at least potentially? How can you see that changing not only the security relationship, but the economic relationship?
Well, there's no doubt that both the United States and the Japanese industrial sectors involved in national security, it's not just defense, writ large, need to integrate themselves much more substantially. Our budgets just can't afford to be independent and independently minded for the long term. And our alliance allows for us to be basically comprehensively involved with each other. And we should be, but we're not. We license a lot of technology. We do some limited co-production, but we've never really embraced the opportunity of what we call an economy of scale and an economy of force between us. It will lower the cost of our defensive systems procurements, which are ridiculously high, frankly, and it's going to increase the effectiveness. And it's going to show to our adversaries and our potential threatening nations that surround us that we are integrated for the long term. If we're integrated in terms of our military production and our national security production, that goes well beyond just the military and involves economic security, which is absolutely critical. People won't be thinking that they can take advantage of us, frankly. I think that it's economic security is something we need to pay much more attention to in the context of the U.S.-Japan alliance.
Yes.
Hi, my name is Yoso Furumoto, a reporter of Japan's Mainichi newspaper. Thank you for doing this today. Regarding the U.S.-Japan ROK trilateral relationship, this report recommends the United States should not render judgment on the sensitive historical issues. That's quite understandable. But at the same time, it says, as a recommendation for Japan, Japan should confront the historical issues. I felt there's a judgment there, meaning Japan's official standpoint on these issues do have some problems. If I understand this sentence correctly. Could you elaborate what this sentence exactly means? Japan should confront the historical issues? Thank you.
What is today? What is August 15th? Yes, he did. This is VJ Day. We didn't have this proposal unveiled today by accident. We dealt painfully with our historical issues. That's why my comments and my colleagues' comments about the difficulty of these historic issues were heartfelt. And we know how potent they are and how powerful they are. And the United States is not going to make a judgment on these issues. But the United States should be using all of our diplomatic energy to try to help the two sides resolve these issues. How they're resolved, in what manner, is something that has to be acceptable to the peoples of both sides. Right now, in both the ROK and in Japan, there's a great matter of populism involved in these issues, and that further sort of muddies the waters. But we had suggested in our report perhaps continued or stepped up track 2 discussions to try to bring, and the United States, as I say, not being judgmental, as we've come to a conclusion through our own painful experience.
If I could briefly add to that, I think it would be useful if political figures in Japan and in other countries in the region stop and ask themselves before they speak or before they take trips to certain places whether what they're doing is in the national interest or whether it is designed to gain domestic political popularity. Is it in the national interest to antagonize a fellow democracy at a time of shifting power balances in the region, for example? That is probably too tall an order to expect politicians in any country, including our own, to stop and think about the national interest before they speak or act. But for those aspiring to higher office or to be statesmen or stateswomen in the future, that would be a good test. And it would be a good test for the media to think about as well. I can take one more quick one. is that Koto Yoichi? Let me look over here then. Yeah, since you came all the way from Tokyo.
We'll do two. We'll make it
We'll
up.
do two,
We'll do
okay.
two.
So Kato-san and then this gentleman here.
Yoichi Kato with Asahi Shimbun. I think the report pointed out rightly the problem that the alliance faces, which is dominance of a third order issue. Futenma, it talks about. And the both government decided to delink this issue from the rest of the roadmap agreement in order to focus on other important issues. But the reality is now we have another third order issue, dominance, which is Osprey deployment in Japan. And it seems to me we never can really overcome this issue of third order issue dominance in alliance management. And my question is, why do you think we continue to have this problem of third order issue dominance? Is that a Japan problem?
Asahi Shimbun.
What? Okay. Weak Japanese political leadership, or is this a problem which comes with the structure of the forward deployment? And how can we overcome this? Thank you.
Yes, we did describe Futenma, and I guess by extension Osprey, as a third order issue. The point being that we start and hope that our colleagues in Japan will start from the position of what's in the long-term national interest. We're not virgins up here. We understand that in many cases the military, U.S. military occupation of the bases in Japan is a burden, particularly in Okinawa. We understand that. So we have to, the burden's on us to be extra thoughtful about our approach and to be very careful and cautious in our consultations with the government of Japan. But for too long, these third order issues have taken all the oxygen out of the room. And whenever the Secretary of State or the Secretary of Defense of the United States and their colleagues in Japan would start to talk about the interests of the United States or the interest of Japan and the re-rise of China, it would devolve to Futenma, what I call the F word. And as soon as the F word came out, that's all anybody wanted to talk about. So what we're trying to do here is to say, let's not let the tail wag the dog. Don't let Futenma and Osprey take the place of our larger interest and our larger relationship and our larger alliance. In my view, there are always ways to work these out, but it's going to take some real thoughtfulness from both, and probably a little, what would you say, compromise on both sides, given where we are now.
Good morning. Thank you for having me. Mike Cromwell, U.S. House. Mike Cromwell, U.S. House. Thank you for having me. Good morning. Let me just start off by saying I spent a great deal of my formative years in Japan. I lived for quite some time in Misawa in the Aomori Prefecture. I have a defense-related question. How do you think DM Morimoto will do? Obviously, Noto felt he had to rearrange his cabinet, replace 5 of his 18 ministers. Tanaka was sacked and replaced him with Morimoto. So how do you think he'll pan out as a defense minister? He's known for being more of an academic than a politician. And my second question is in general, again, but to the gentleman in the red tie in regards to your statement on Iran and Japan being on the sanctions list. Recently, Japan went off the sanctions list and has been importing Iranian oil. Do you think that affects the U.S.-Japan alliance? And if so, well, what am I saying? How is Japan planning on joining a unified sanctions front? Thank you.
I can take the first part of your question. I think he'll do fine. The tough part for the U.S. side is how these positions continue to change, with prime ministers or within an administration. And I think the current defense minister will be fine. It's just that we need to have some stability with that regard. But again, the report is looking at a longer term, and it's not focused on individuals and players in the alliance for today, but a longer term, and that's what's the key part and what's important here.
With regard to Iran and sanctions, the U.S. sanctions policy requires that importers of Iranian crude make substantial reductions in those imports. That substantial reduction is not defined precisely, so the State Department decides what's substantial and what's not. As we know, Europe has completely stopped importing Iranian oil. But Japan not only made substantial reductions in State Department's view in the first half of this year, but also early on in the process showed respect for our for the sanctions policy itself, engaged in active discussions with the State Department to make sure that their planned reductions, which have been coming down year after year, would satisfy the U.S. requirement, which it did. And I think, again, in an environment where Iran's oil use and imports are rising overall because of the shutdown of electric plants, it's remarkable and a sign of the strong nature of our alliance that in this environment, Japan implemented these difficult reductions in Iranian imports. Now, going forward, there is the issue of how to ensure the tankers that are bringing Iranian crude back to Japan and other countries. And Japan has put in place an ability to insure those tankers because that insurance was withdrawn due to European sanctions. So the U.S., again, is not asking Japan to completely halt its imports of Iranian crude, just to substantially reduce them. It has been doing so, and I would expect Japan will continue to remain in close contact with the United States, continue to reduce its imports from Japan, and thereby contribute to the economic pressure that's being put on the regime.
Thank you all. We did the first of these bipartisan reports 12 years ago. A lot of us had more, well, some of us had more hair then. We took that report in 2001, and it was the document that was used in the Situation Room for the Deputies Committee meeting to decide on policy towards Japan and Asia, in one of the early meetings, as Torkel and Rich and others will recall, in the Bush administration. We're not certain whether this particular document will have a similar role in the Situation Room in future, but part of the purpose here is not just to give our ideas on what we need to do to revitalize the alliance, but to stimulate a debate and a discussion. We didn't answer every question by any means, and hopefully this will spark that, and we'll get some feedback. Some will be negative, some will be positive, but we'll generate some attention to the need to add vitality to our alliance again, as we have in the past. And all of you attending today is real encouragement for us that, that there's interest in that. So thank you very much for joining us.
I don't think the government should engage in that. It's the, as I said, that there are many like-minded people inside China who needs the encouragement.